think I'm looking forward to them all. But Emma Gibbons is one of the clever people on the block for sure. So has been doing a lot of research into AI, particularly into HR and talent acquisition, and has worked all over the world, working in the talent acquisition space and in the HR transformation and consulting space. So she helps businesses translate their business performance ambitions into talent strategies. She's also recently joined a friend of mine in the UK as well, with a new product that we're hoping to show you in November on our Changemakers event, which we'll share more on later. So Lou is going to talk to you about, it's actually, I'm sorry, not Lou, Emma is going to do a workshop with you. So lots of interaction today on how to avoid selecting the wrong AI tools for HR. And trust me, it can be very easy to do. There's a lot to know. So Emma, oh, and I should also say, Scott Allen, who works for Talent Tech Solutions, is going to join her a little bit to help her out on the chats as well. So so the two of them are going to be moving around the tables to talk with you all through this. I'm going to shut up and hand over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And you can see my slides? Can I get a thumbs up maybe in the chat that everybody is able to see? Perfect. Okay, cool. I am going to just go into the window so I can see what I'm talking about. I'm only on one laptop today. I don't have multiple screens, so I won't be able to see the chat. But if there's any questions, Andrea, maybe you could just let me know. So thank you for the introduction, Andrea. That's really great, and I'm so excited to be here today. This has been a bit of an evolution of my own journey and learning what I've learned, and me wanting to uplift and share knowledge that the journey I've been on with my peers, you guys today on the session. So as Andrea said, I'm actually currently a product manager for People Science at an AI-based chatbot. It's a coaching chatbot, and the company is called View. We won't be talking so much about View today, but we'll be drawing a little bit more on my experience of over in the UK in the last 20 years working as a management consultant. I've specialised in HR transformation. That's covered everything from assessments to technology to change management, the people and process elements as well. In 2018, I went freelance, and one of my roles, I have a couple of different organisations that I work with, but one of them being a product manager at View. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of me talking, and then I'm actually going to come across to the tables, and we're actually going to do a workshop exercise. So you don't need to listen to me for the next 50 minutes. So what we'll be covering is just a little bit of light updates and information about what different AI types in HR we're talking about in this session today. We're going to also discuss looking at validity, reliability, and ethical nature of AI, and why should you even care about that as an HR practitioner. We'll also share some key takeaways. So I've got 2 takeaway checklists for you. One, if you are look after the technology at your organization, and it's more about the vendor relationship. And then if you're an HR practitioner yourself, some questions that you should be sort of reflecting upon as you engage with AI-based HR tools. And then the last part, the most part of the session, we're going to do an activity where we'll look at things like where bias might be creeping into hiring decisions. Can you identify if a tool is valid or not with some of the scenarios that we've got? And we'll actually do that over on a whiteboard on the tables. So let me just come back to, okay. Not sure what's happening with my slide deck here. Okay, can you guys still see that now?
presentation mode. There we go. Now it is.
Perfect. I don't know why it was jumping to the end of the deck, but anyway, that's technology for you. I wish I had AI helping me now doing this. But I'm not going to delve too long on this, but I think what actually helps sometimes is just a little bit of definitions, a shared language for us to all be speaking from the same sort of page. So this information that I'm sharing with you as well was actually part of a 3-part blog series that I collaborated with Scott Allen, who's on the session as well today. So anything that I'm sharing today, because we've got such a short period of time, if you want to delve a bit deeper and look at further articles, blogs, podcasts, etc., we've got the links in this deck, which will be shared out, I think, after the session. And you can actually delve a little bit deeper into that blog series, and there's many, many resources for you to read up if this is of interest to you. So the first type of AI in HR that we'll explore today is machine learning. Probably a lot of you have heard about this. So this is algorithm-based. It's essentially looks at elements like how the neural networks in our brain are mapped and how our brains work, and tries to sort of map that into algorithmic form. So algorithms will take information or data points, and they'll actually learn from that and make predictions. And that is actually called training data or priming data that the algorithms use to actually make sense and make decisions of the data points. So some HR examples that you may have already come across might be your ATS, where your ATS would suggest maybe a higher match score for a certain candidate to a role that you might have open. It might also, so in terms of how the machine learning is built, that is actually taking training data from, usually the vendors will use past successful hires into your organization or current top performers in role, and they'll actually use that as the priming or training data to teach the machine learning what good looks like to match that against job descriptions. And over time, as a user of those tools, as a practitioner, it actually will learn. And that's what it means by machine learning. Just as humans learn, the algorithm can learn over time as well. So the more data inputs that it receives and the rules that it uses to sort that information, the smarter essentially it gets. So over time, things like new CVs come into the ecosystem, new job descriptions. As a recruiter, a lot of the HR AI tools will have some recruiter user insights. So you can actually tell the AI and help train it why that candidate might not be a right fit for that role. Some of them use a thumbs up, thumbs down. Some of them will actually allow you to put some further refinement and fit information in there. So that's example number 1. Okay, I'm not sure why. Here we go. So example number 2 is what we call natural language processing. And this is actually what View, the product, does. And it's about taking human to machine text and voice understanding. So it's the ability for the algorithm to not only understand this is basic training data that I've been shared, but it also has that ability to interpret languages so it can hear or read information. So chatbots are a really great example of this, of that at play. So you might have seen in some ATSs, or there's some AI chatbots that specifically are for recruitment, where it would allow the candidate to answer a series of questions and give real-time feedback. The AI bot would then capture that information, pull that back into the candidate's profile, and then actually recalibrate the sort of review of that candidate and the match to the job description. So that's one example here.
Emma, can I just interrupt and ask a question, please?
Sure.
Fiona Morton is asking, do you have a recommended number of data points to ensure the recommendations?
Yes, and it's a very good question, and there is no one size fits all. And we're going to actually talk about validity in a moment and give you a checklist around. It's less the number and more what the data the data points actually are. And I can talk to a specific example of a bare minimum that would be required when it comes to, for example, building out an assessment model. You'd be looking at around 100 people to build out a very valid and rigorous assessment model. Let's say you took an engineering profile and you wanted to build an assessment model in maybe a gamified setting, you would be looking for a best practice of around about 100 profiles. And the vendor would work with you on that. It could actually be partly that the vendor has some aggregated data that can start to kick off that for you, and you would then supplement that with the data from your own organisation. So taking the top performers within your organisation to sort of bespokely or make that more relevant for your own business itself. The last one I'm going to talk about is computer vision, which can actually be thought of the ability of machines to see an image or a picture, or even understand in real time what's happening on a video format. So when you do an introduction to machine learning or computer vision, they get you to play with pictures of puppies and cats, and you use that as your training data to say to the algorithm, this is what a dog looks like versus what a cat looks like. So that's just a basic version of what it means for the algorithm to see and understand what an image is. So in HR, some applications of that have been, especially in the Nordic countries, they've been testing for a few years, biometric facial recognition. So instead of your ID badge, where everyone, I know personally, I hate my photos on those badges, but utilising as someone walks into the office, the facial recognition to allow them access to the office. A somewhat controversial example as well, I won't name the vendor, but it has been video-based facial analysis. So looking at micro expressions to assign traits and qualities of a candidate as they complete an online digital interview. So that's another example there. So when we talk about validity in HR AI, what we actually mean by that is the tool doing what it intended to do? Now, I'm a very big fan of Dr. Thomas and the quote that I've put here on the chat. He is part of the University in the US, MIT Sloan Management. He has numerous academic peer-reviewed articles. He also takes those articles and writes blogs about them, and he's probably the #1 person that I always look out for sort of his information and his latest thinking, because it comes directly from the academic space and brings that across into the research and practice space. So his view is that we've sort of got this datafication of talent. We've got all these data points, and because we live in such a digital world, and the pace of technology is super exciting, but it's moving really, really fast. And what has actually happened is there's created this gap between the academic theory world and the actual practice, us as practitioners in the real world, and what we do with that. And some of the concerns, so again, all these articles that I'm linking to or refer to, they're all in the appendix for today, so if you want to read more. But one of the biggest findings from last year, which was a review done by the Journal of Work and Org Psych, was that this gap is getting bigger, and there's a lot of concerns that they have, but two of the more pertinent ones for us today is that these vendors have moved a lot faster than the validation world of academic. And what I mean by that is, in the world of academic science, there is the requirement of validation study upon validation study upon validation study to essentially be able to trust that what the data is telling us can be generalized outside of just a one-off experiment setting. So what this particular review done last year found is that there's actually a lack of validation studies around the technology delivery So let's take an example, and I'm going to talk about assessments today because I think it just draws out the some of the points a bit clearer. So if we take a psychometric assessment, which has been validated for the last 50, 60 years in science, so we know that it's true and it works and it's valid, but we know that it works in the setting offline. What we don't have is what's called longitudinal data, and we don't have enough what's called meta-analysis data. So that's thousands upon thousands of data points to validate that what you might have done offline, and when you put that into an algorithmic setting, a digital setting, that doesn't actually have any effect on the validity of what the tool is doing. So that's concern number one. And then the other concern for them of this theory to practice gap is that a large portion of us as real world practitioners, we might not actually be sufficiently equipped to understand the accuracy of the tools or evaluate the accuracy. And I'll put my hand up and say that was me 5 years ago. I was in charge of purchasing AI-based tools for organizations. I thought I knew, how they worked. But when I sat down opposite data scientists and occupational psychologists, I realized I knew very, very little. So me personally, I went back to university and I'm currently a grad student studying neuropsychology to try to understand this better. But there are some actions that we can take as individuals. So before I give you some checklists and we jump into the actual activity, I just wanted to give you a little bit around what we mean by valid, and some questions that you might want to start thinking about when you're talking to existing vendors that you might have as partners or future vendors that you also might be looking at purchasing their technology. So I'm going to stick with the HR assessment tools, and I'll specifically more focus on talent acquisition assessment tools. But what we mean by valid is it is accurate and it can reliably give us a method to measure something. In the world of OxPsych, we call that a construct. So I won't go through each of these here, but just a hint, when you're doing the activity, some of these things are to think about when you're looking at some of the scenarios. So what we mean by valid is, for example, predictive criterion validity essentially just means, do the scores of that assessment, do they correlate, or have they statistically shown a correlation or the ability to predict an outcome measure? So if you're trying to test for a particular soft skill, has it been shown to be predictive or correlated to an outcome measure of the person when they're actually in their role? Another example of that is content validity. So does the assessment fully represent what it actually sets out to? So say we have a test, we want to make sure that the testing actually reflects as much of the role that the person will be doing as possible, because there's no point assessing someone for something that they're not going to need to use in the position that you are actually assessing them for. And then another one is what we call parallel forms reliability, and it comes back to the previous point which I just talked about, which is there enough consistency across the same measure, but when you put it into a different setting? So if we can say that if a human to human was to do a psychometric based assessment, and then we took the human out and we brought a machine in, would the same construct or the same thing that we're testing for, would the statistical measure be consistent and equivalent in the different formats, the offline human and the online AI-based algorithm? So the next part is then, if we can understand if our AI is valid, that's excellent. But what about ethics and trust? Now, at the moment, this is another example of where the tech has sped up so quickly. Academic hasn't kept up with that, but neither has actually law. So although at the moment there is no mandated international laws or local laws that are required around ethics and legislation on what we do with AI in HR, it is coming. And I think it is always changing, but essentially Australia is a little bit behind in this, but we're two nations or regions of the world for us to sort of look to for trends that may be coming our way. One's the US, so there is one called the New York City Bias Proposal, and that is basically taking existing legislation around anti-discrimination and making sure that that legislation can be applied to non-human discrimination and actually applied to AI-based discrimination. So some of those elements that's built into that would include making sure that candidates are told up front that not only a human will be assessing them, but also an algorithm could be, and that vendors will also be responsible within that legislation for annual audits to make sure that they remove discrimination. Now, a good vendor will actually already do this. They know that it makes their product better. They know that it actually is morally and ethically responsible to do so, but the law is sort of shifting to make sure that this is catching up with the practice. Now, 2 states in the US have actually taken that even further. The state of Illinois actually requires you to get candidate consent before you use any video analysis. And there were a couple of other states which have actually made it illegal now to use any video analysis on candidates during a recruitment process. The big one, I think, that potentially might come down and filter through to Australia, and especially if you're using international vendors, is the European Union regulation on AI systems, which was proposal was put forward in April of this year. And the implications are not just for the vendor who provides the technology, but also for the company that uses the platform. And when they say company, they don't just mean the compliance officer or the head of IT. They actually mean the users. Now, what has been put forward in that is that as an individual user, i.e. a recruiter, an HR manager, a hiring manager, they actually have to understand and comprehend what the AI is actually telling you. So if you were to take anything away from what I just explained, 2 key takeaways is understanding the output. So what did the AI use to actually come to that decision? And is it fair and is it appropriate? That's more for the individual level. And then for those of you that may be in charge of actually your tech ecosystem or your tech stacks for HR, there's a really great group called For Humanity. They're a non-for-profit that are sort of spearheading this particular area. And they're working very closely with the European Union. They're also working very closely with the New York Mayor's office on both of these proposals. And what looks like it's potentially coming down the pipeline will be requirements of organisations to do what's called an independent audit. So that's not an internal review. It's not just an audit by the vendor, but the company itself will bring in an independent auditor to look at the risk and scrutinise not only the tool, but also what's called bias mitigation by design. So all the support structures around that, the policies, the processes, people training, the laws, and making sure that there is fairness in any prediction rankings or any decisions that are going to be made by artificial intelligence. So as HR, what can we do to help bridge the gap? So for those of you that have conversations with your vendors, here's a takeaway checklist. I didn't create this. This was created by the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. Again, they are an excellent resource if you're needing support or wanting to read up a bit more about this. I've put a link to their website in the appendix of this as well. But here are some checklist questions that they recommend you to engage with current vendors and also to engage in future vendors when you might be doing an RFP process. So they cover things from the validity. So, asking them, have you validated the tool in ways that comply with legal and professional standards? Asking how the data is gathered. Is there evidence around that supports that reliability? Do they actually recalibrate and debias the algorithm at least once a year? So those are some of the questions that should be thought about there. And then for an individual, there's less control you have over what tech your organisation tells you to use. But this is something that I sort of thought about myself. And again, this list also comes from the PsyOp group. But it's if you need to use an existing tool or start using a new tool, some of the questions you could be asking yourself is, do you understand what it's assessing for? Does the tool measure what it claims to, and is it consistent? And if no one in your team can answer those questions, perhaps there's other people in your organisation that sort of are the owners, internal owners of these vendor relationships that you might be able to reach out to ask these questions of. And then there's the ethical lens as well about being transparent with our candidates. So are we required by law to tell our candidates that AI is being used? If not, perhaps that's not something we need to do right now. Or is it transparent to candidates and employees that their data is being collected, and how do they opt out? So if a candidate was to ask you that, do you know how that would actually work for them? And could you share with them what data is actually being collected for them? And if you don't know those answers, should you be using the tool? I'm sure your boss, your team lead absolutely would be saying, yes, you do need to be using the tool. But coming down potentially in the future could be a place where we as individuals actually have a sense of that ownership over understanding what it is that we're engaging with, and we're partnering with this technology to make a human a technology combined related decision when it comes to candidate selection within recruitment. So I'm going to stop talking now, and we're going to move into an activity to review a hypothetical scenario. Now, we're going to try and do this in the Miro board on the canvas. So in a minute, we'll jump over to the tables, and myself and Scott will move around some of the tables. But I've given you sort of two little prompts, two toolkits that you can consider as you're looking at the different scenarios and discussing those with your table, which is one is, what are the most valid types of assessment? So what actually stacks up as predictive or a strong correlation? So as we can see, job experience is pretty low. So anything of a 0.5 and above is statistically significant, which means that there is a strong correlation score. So we can see that the kind of gold standard is multi-measure tests at 0.71. And that basically means it looks at tests that will measure multiple constructs. So it could be cognitive, it could be social, emotional, strengths and personality combined, followed closely by pure cognitive tests, and then structured interviews wraps out the sort of top three. Your bottom ones, not surprisingly, psychic predictions is not very high. Job experience is a very low indicator of predicting performance in role, as well as unstructured interviews as well. So just reflect back on this when you're looking at some of the scenarios. Now, this is the what we've got over in the Miro boards. So as a group, what would be great is this is just, there's no right or wrong answer, but it is just to facilitate discussion amongst your group. On the actual Miro boards, if you want to pick up a post-it note and just put a B for bias, a V for validity, or an E for ethics, where you think that there might be potential risk. So each of the boxes has a mini scenario for you to consider, and then just discuss that with your groups. So I'll move around some of the tables, come and have a listen. If anyone's got any questions, we'll be able to have a look there as well. So I'm going to